developing issue around energy is, can Canada actually create a coherent national energy strategy?
We've got to get rid of all the political agendas. Sit down and start to go back to basics and say, what do we have? What do we need to address? And start from principles to focus on what do we need to do as Canada.
Without getting into whose climate models you like and whose climate models you don't like, the general principle I have simplistically is we can't keep adding CO2 to the atmosphere and increasing that concentration indefinitely without consequence.
The issue of climate change is one that has been discussed pretty widely over the last 20 years, all through North America. And the response on the Canadian side has been a growing awareness that it's real and that at some point in the future it will have measurable impacts on their lifestyle and on their costs of living and on the cost of goods that they consume.
In terms of Canada's overall focus on reducing emissions, Canada, like the US, has signed up to a 17% reduction versus 2005 by 2020 in its carbon emissions. So it's made a commitment there. We can talk about, is that enough? But the fact of the matter is that there certainly has been a recognition that something needs to be done.
So because there's such diversity, the issues are quite unique in each province. And so oftentimes the challenge is how do you continue to keep the economy growing? How are you competitive on the world stage?
The thing that is a challenge for us is that because our single biggest consumer of our goods and services is the U.S., if we get out of step with the U.S., too far out of step, our commodities, our goods and services will price themselves out of the U.S. market.
So Canada also has to try and balance this sort of, this difficult situation of not wanting to leap too far ahead of the US because it doesn't want to be uncompetitive, but on the other hand, not being perceived as being a laggard either.
So I think that the question of whether or not Canada's energy future will be vibrant and bright is in many ways dependent on the collaborative relationships they set up with the U.S. and also to a certain extent the competitive relationships that they establish, for instance, in the Pacific Rim. One example of this is the issue of whether or not Canada could or should be able to get heavy oil products out. China has a tremendous demand for oil. They also have a tremendous demand for coal.
For us to ignore the fact that we're shipping our coal to countries and they're burning it in coal-fired plants, and we frown on that here, that's ridiculous. I don't think we should be burning coal anywhere.
The Canadian government has decided to take the approach around reducing emissions on a sector-by-sector basis. So already they have looked at the transportation sector, and their decision was, we're just going to harmonize our approach with the U.S. Because the vehicles that we produce in Canada are used in the U.S. and we buy vehicles from the U.S., it makes sense to harmonize. So we're going with the CAFE standards that the U.S. has set. On electricity, we have set new regulation for electricity generation. You won't be able to build a standard coal plant in the future in Canada. It'll have to include either new technology or carbon capture and storage in order to build a new coal plant.
Since all energy resources are pretty unique, we need some common denominator to be able to say what would be underneath an energy policy that unites all these disparate energy development and generation forms. And at the end of the day, I think that common element is a carbon equivalency. That is, that embedded in every energy use is a consumption of carbon issue or a release of carbon waste products.
So in British Columbia, they have a carbon tax, $30 a ton currently. I think it's going to continue to increase, and it's applied equally to all fossil fuel combustion.
So consumers, the end users of carbon, are paying a few cents per liter on gasoline. And they've been raising that. And generally, British Columbians have been okay with that. We put up with all kinds of excise taxes on other things like alcohol or tobacco, and people generally accept them. Taxing carbon, I think people could get used to the idea. People then would change their behavior. They would find other alternative sources of transportation. They would walk more. They would carpool more. They would maybe take public transit more. They would make some changes so that they're not paying as much in transportation.
British Columbia has a carbon tax. Alberta has a carbon levy, and there's a slight distinction between the two. BC's applies across the board, and it goes into general revenue into the government.
In Alberta, as a different example, what they had decided to do is work with the large emitters, the industrial emitters. So if you're emitting over 100,000 tons, you have intensity targets that are set for you by the provincial government, and you have 3 ways of meeting that target. You can improve the energy efficiency within your own operation of that facility.
They can purchase offsets, or they can pay into a technology fund. It's a $15 per ton cost.
That fund is used to fund innovation around how do you solve the problem of carbon emissions. That's a really smart system because, first off, the levy creates an incentive to implement technology to address the carbon emissions issues, but the funds collected on the levy go into developing the technologies that might help solve the problem because we don't have them right now.
The problem is they're simply not working very well. Alberta is actually only on track to meet its climate target by about 1/3.
But I think Alberta did some really smart things around the way this regulation is set up. First off, the regulation is set up so that it's relatively unintrusive. So it allowed them to put the structure in place and gave them the controls without getting too much pushback because the thresholds were low enough that it wasn't too intrusive. And now they've got controls that they can start turning up as the political will to take action increases.
Right now, we're not maximizing our investments in the clean energy economy. We only are about 1% of the 1 trillion clean energy economy today. And we know that that clean energy market is likely to expand to $3 trillion by 2020. So there is significant growth in that economy, and we don't want Canada to be left behind.
Both for the United States and Mexico and Canada, it doesn't really make sense to keep using the word independence anymore. It makes a lot of sense to have a North American pattern of development, a North American pattern of investment, and along with that, North American stimulus for capital movement, and in fact, lower barriers and common standards for using some of these products.
Even if those countries, Canada and the United States, have pulled out of Kyoto Accord, Canada's federal government, all 10 provincial governments, they would have an environmental policy. They'd be different in the spectrum of how intense they are, but all of them would say publicly, yeah, we need to reduce our carbon. Where they differ is on how and how quickly we need to do it.
I looked back at the Rio 1992 Canadian Outcomes Report, and the challenges that are listed in that outcome report are no timelines, no will, undermining the existence of anthropogenic climate change. It's 20 years later, and those are still the exact same barriers. The only difference is that Canada has now slid from trying to take a leadership role and encouraging those things to realizing that we have a massive potential market resource and realizing that the environment might not play as big a role as it should in that.
There's no appetite for slowing down. Everybody wants a 5,000 square foot house. We have and want their SUVs. And I think at some point in time, whether they want to listen or understand it, or they're going to have to listen. You turn on the news and they're talking about food shortages and fresh water shortages, global warming, and we're not slowing down or curtailing our actions. And these are things that are being proven that are going to affect us.
What we need to do is, what's next? What are the next few steps in the process that we need to be stretching toward? You need to be looking at investing in the near-term improvements to the existing infrastructure. You need to be looking at what should the next level of infrastructure look like and investing in that. And you need to be investing a certain amount in the long-term, the stuff that isn't even on the radar now, the stuff that's way down the road, because those are the solutions that we ultimately need to address the situation.
I think we've got to get rid of all the political agendas and all the posturing that's been going on. The ads that get taken out, the us versus them, it's those silly environmentalists or that silly industry. We need to throw that all away.
If you've got a concern about international development, you're talking about energy. If you've got a concern about health, it's closely related to energy. Transportation, economics, global trade. It doesn't really matter what area of kind of the global system you're involved in. It's tied to energy.
If we don't make a concerted effort to move towards the low carbon future, the world will just move past us. And we'll become an island that has not dealt with the issue, and it'll become harder for us to be a citizen of the world community.
We have to collaborate and work together across the country, absolutely. Federally and provincially, absolutely. Canada and the US, absolutely. But also in Europe and Germany and Australia and Asia. We have to identify where the expertise and know-how is, figure out how to link it together and come up with the solutions that are going to work.